key terms and concepts related to EbA, right? Ecosystem-based adaptation. And I think from last session, we are definitely in agreement with the role and the services and the goods that we get from the natural environment. I think we have an understanding of the ecosystems and these goods and services that they provide and the importance to economic and social development. So in terms of this particular topic, we're going to get into some of the concepts related to EbA. We're going to look at urban and peri-urban areas, nature-based solutions, EbA for climate change adaptation. What does that mean? Green infrastructure, blue-green infrastructure, green-gray infrastructure. And of course, we have more tools that we look at throughout the course. Resilience. What is resilience? What are resilient cities and ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction? So if we can go ahead. Well, you'll need to tell me when I'm not slide sharing. I mean, when I'm
Maybe
not.
need to go in presentation mode. Yeah.
Yes. Because I don't use a laptop on a day-to-day basis. I use a desktop and it's huge, the screen. So I'm seeing it big, and you're probably seeing some people who use laptops, they've seen it like a little thumbnail, you know. So you need to remind me. So the key concept one is looking at urban and peri-urban areas. And in this case, we're looking at the profile of urban areas. And if we consider the areas that we defined as urban areas earlier, do they fit these characteristics? So we're looking at, and what is missing from this particular profile? So we're saying here that they're the engines of economic economic growth. They're economic hubs. When we talk about urban areas, we think about the notion of urbanization, and you know, within that concept, we're thinking about things like modern age development. Urban areas able to provide opportunities for people, for businesses. We may have dense habitation, infrastructure, fast-paced activities. These urban centers, you have increasing demands for goods and services, water, energy, food. They may contribute to climate change through greenhouse gas emissions, susceptible to the effects of climate change and its effects. Many environmental and biochemical challenges exist within the urban landscape. So we have things like stormwater runoff and flood risks. We spoke a little bit about stormwater runoff last week and some of the applications that could be considered EbA applications that were in place as it related to things like sidewalks and parking spaces, etc. We also have chemical and particulate pollution of urban air, soil, water. We have this notion of urban heat islands. We have summer heat waves. We also have this whole notion in many cities of unplanned development, which leads to significant declines in ecosystems and reduces the capacity of cities and their systems to be resilient. Is there anything that we have missed? Is there anything that was added here that we think does not apply to Jamaica? What do we think about the notion of this urban heat island? Are we experiencing some of that in Kingston, in some of our urban areas? How has urbanization altered our natural environment? Or how have urban areas altered the natural environment? How are they currently altering the natural environment? What are we seeing? So look at these 8 characteristics. What is applicable to our urban areas as we know them? What is not applicable? And I believe this is the picture here of Montego Bay on the screen. What is going on with habitation in Kingston or in some of our, Michaela?
Overcrowding. So it degrades the land itself and the functions of our environment within that particular space. So overcrowding can cause you have limited drainage, heat wave, noise pollution. Yeah, those are a few.
Okay, Christina, thanks, Michaela. Christina, your hand is up.
I agree. The only thing I would add would be waste generation. I think a lot of the urban centers develop a lot of not only solid, but is it liquid waste, but sewage that, is hard for us to manage and maintain. I think that's a function of some of these urban developments, but I do agree, especially with the urban heat cities. I mean, most of us would talk about the fact that once we leave Kingston, the air gets lighter and we like going to the countryside because of how the air feels. So yeah, I agree with everything on this list and would just add waste generation.
And waste, and then we could also look at the typologies of that waste that we're seeing coming out of, I mean, do we have figures for the amount? We know that Jamaica, I believe, and somebody can correct me, we generate about a little above 1 kilogram or more, a little above 2.2 pounds of waste per person per day. Now, I don't know if that is higher in Kingston. It possibly is higher in Kingston, in the urban areas, but there is also this, we may be generating higher volumes of waste. I mean, so we have solid waste on one hand, but we also have, we may be generating higher volumes of e-waste and white waste. And of course, there is the sewage that we just spoke about, and so on. So waste is one that we need to include here. Shamoy, your hand is up.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Also, the displacement of different species. So for example, I remember when I was younger, I used to have what we call like ground lizards and stuff like that. I couldn't tell the last time I saw a ground lizard. And other species that normally would occupy the space.
Okay, so we may have displacement of species as we have new developments and so on. I see Adrian, your hand is up. Adrian.
All right, I actually mentioned a point about increased CO2 or fuel emissions, which can also lead to increased air quality problems or air quality challenges really in some of these urban centers. But something also to take away when waste management was mentioned earlier. What about the capacity? Because urban centers or cities or metropolises will generate waste, but there's going to also be an issue of capacity, because if capacity does not exist to manage waste, especially with regard to growing urbanization and growing industrialization, that can also put an increased strain on an urban center's capacity to manage, and can also lead to problems such as greater pollution. So that has to be taken into account as well.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks for that. Ashley?
Hello again, everyone. To complement Shamoy's comment, we have, with the expansion of urban areas, you have encroachment into habitat. So we see that with Portmore and the crocodiles that are there, and that has increased the interaction between humans and those species, and oftentimes persons fear crocodiles, so you see a lot of illegal killing of them. And also to complement Adrian's point, we do have capacity issues where the infrastructure that was originally in place to support these urban areas have long the population size has grown to a point that those particular facilities can't support them anymore, and that is now creating strains on areas outside of the urban landscape where we pull on for those resources. So a lot of water is channeled towards Kingston, and of course that can and has led to issues in those communities where more resources are being taken away and directed into the urban areas.
Thanks for that, Ashley. Roseanne?
Hi, good afternoon, or morning still. Yes, in terms of the urbanization, and the increased urbanization, it does lower the Earth's albedo and causes increased heating, and that in itself has an impact on the elderlies, and other health issues may occur as a result of that heating. Besides that, there's a lot of developments to accommodate the increased number in terms of people. And with these development, we have pressure on our water supply, pressure on the sewage, pressure on solid waste collection. And because of that, some areas might be neglected. And so you have all these garbage in the gullies that every time I pass, it gives me a headache, because we have all these coastal cleaning, which I still think don't make any sense because of how it's done. But yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. But it's a combination, and it's a very complex issue, because one is like a domino effect, one is linked, because even with these development, in every room there is an AC, and in a sense we are contributing and not, we're playing this kind of cat and mouse game with it, because yeah, so it's a complex issue to deal with. But at the same time, I think our approach to it has to be, it cannot be done in isolation or in a vacuum.
Thank you, Roseanne. And just to even mention the link between, you mentioned the elderly, but yes, that's correct. But another group that is significantly impacted by heat as well is children. So children and the elderly bear the brunt of
Definitely,
the impact.
pregnant women, yeah.
And also, one of the things we need to remember is the health-related issues as a result of increasing heat. So for example, we are already in Jamaica affected by things like the rotavirus, which contributes to gastroenteritis. And I think it's in the drier, hotter months. So if you're thinking, if we're extending the heat to other months, you could see an increase in those kinds of diseases as well. I saw Adrian's hand up. Where are you, Adrian?
I'm here. I just wanted to say that some parts of it is also missed opportunity. For example, 60% of our waste in Kingston is organic, and so it's a failure on our part to convert that into fertilizers. For example, pardon the noise, I'm in the train station. So if we continue to not exploit these particular resources, they'll continue to be a problem. So that's the intervention I want to make for now.
All right, so even within the increase, so I think what Adrian is saying is, even with the increasing amount of waste, we also need to recognize opportunities of waste as a resource. So in the case of, if 60% of the waste we generate in Jamaica is organic, how then do we utilize that waste into, do we begin to develop, for example, industries around the green economy, say related to composting? If we're going into this whole notion of organic farming, or we're looking to export more in terms of things like, even, it's not just raw vegetables, but we're also could look at things about, the pesticide content in things like pepper sauces or jerk sauces, etc. Those also need to be reduced to get into some of the North American markets. So yes, within the urban and peri-urban spaces, we also need to think about these opportunities. How do we you know, as I say, create these huge compost areas that can then sell that product to, from football fields to farmers, etc. Howard.
Just want to add that if urbanization is properly planned and developed, you really don't have to have a fallout in terms of its impact on the environment, because a properly planned urban center would take into consideration the possible effects on the environment. Just want to add that.
Well,
So
right.
even if you do clear land, you know, with a properly planned structure, if you're going to find that certain species will be affected, you could even create artificial zones where you could transport those species into that zone. So the point I'm making, with a properly planned urban center, it would take into consideration the possible effects on the environment.
Right, and we're not just looking at effects on the environment. I think that's one, and that's great, but we're also looking at opportunities. You know, what can this urbanization, what can we get from it that is good? So for example, you know, Adrian's point about, you know, waste as a resource, how then, you know, yes, we're gonna have, you know, higher volumes of waste, then what can we do about that? You know, and what are the opportunities there? So, I mean, discussions like these become key. I'm seeing Howard's hand and Cheryl's hand. Tell me if I don't think I pronounced your name correct, but I'll go with Cheryl first and then Howard. And
No,
then,
I should just lower my hand. That should have been taken down. I've made the point already.
okay, so Adrian, your hand is up again, but I'll go with Cheryl first and then Adrian again.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm compelled to ask a question based on the fact that it was mentioned, I believe, by Howard, where he said properly planned urban area. And I just want to throw out what is meant by properly planned. And when we look at the context of what happens in Jamaica as to who can override certain recommendations that would constitute properly planned urban center, and the kind of tug of war that we face, and some agencies are more, I would call it, influenced than others in whether fighting for or yielding up based on where they are positioned. Because we would say that we have adequate policies and laws and standards and this and that, but them actually being reflected in a spatial manner and on the ground is another matter. And so when we're speaking of development, yes, when we're speaking of appropriate development and resilience, we were looking at the same EbA. And as we spoke before about mangrove area and it being filled for hotel as an example. And we sit at a table between those who would say this brings in foreign exchange of X million, this brings in a number of jobs here, and the spill-off effect of something like tourism. And we're speaking of this. How compelling a conversation or argument can we put forward to enable those who can overrule well thought out, well understood, and glaring in front of you what the issues are, that it is worthwhile pursuing development in another manner or not doing development in this zone? I personally, for me, there's something, our reality that we face, and we always talk about politics and planning as to how that operate, because this is I would loosely put it, a battle. and so how we are learning about EbA, yes, but there needs to be a point, or I'm not sure if it's a point, but something that is going to, crudely put, just slap individuals in the face that what you're doing is crazy. And it is fine now but tomorrow, which they can't see because what they're seeing is today. So I think we need to look on those kind of things as to how we put forward the argument that is strong and on equal ground with the economic possibilities and returns that everybody would seem to clamor for.
All right, Cheryl, which agency are you from? Remind me.
I'm from UDC.
You're from UDC. Okay, so you are the development agency, we would want to say, right? Responsible for a lot of this urban development and so on.
We
okay.
are one of the agencies that actually affect development, and we have transitioned a lot in incorporating reasonable environmental methodology and controls in our development when we compare what we do today as to probably what we did in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on. And we do a lot of collaboration, but I do know that there are other entities with similarly trained professionals that frequently lose the battle where these are concerned. So sometimes it depends on the genesis of certain concepts and proposals and what you build in from before and the buy-in and consensus you can have. But when things begin in another manner and the dollars are shown and the employment is shown and the transformation is shown and the perception of what is modern, because what is modern? Is modern 13-story buildings with glass doors and glass windows, or is modern incorporating and integrating all the elements that we are now speaking of? So when we say modern, people see high-rise, gray infrastructure, this and that, and you're running through smoothly. But when we say modern, we need to dress modern in another manner. That modern doesn't necessarily mean all the things we see now will present a problem, but modern really look at integrating our realities and the risks and constraints which we face into the kind of development that ideally suits the particular locale that we're working in.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. That was a lot. And we know that on the environmental side, there is a loss of, we tend to lose the battle a lot on the environmental side. Could that be because we do not have the monetary figures? So if we don't value ecosystems, or we don't value, when, or we don't know when the integrity of an ecosystem can be lost. Okay, so it's like your hand, right? You have 5 fingers on your hand. I mean, no, let me use another example. Think of your foot, right? Nobody really recognizes that that little toe on your foot has like the greatest power of all the toes on your foot. So if you've ever had a little toe injury, you would know that you can't walk because it's the toe that balances whether you're 100 pounds, 500 pounds, or 200 pounds, or 150 pounds. It balances your entire body and it enables you to stand up. But if you lose that toe, you somewhat, I think, would lose the integrity of your foot, right? But do we have the information that is required to make these decisions? So your economists come and they have all the data on the employment. We're going to generate 800 jobs and we're going to make X amount, and this is going to be our contribution to GDP. And then you start to see in people's minds that money already begins to turn, because if we're getting all of this from this hotel, we can build more schools, we can have better roads, we can do this. Does the environment have the data to support? If we do this, 1 Cat 2 hurricane is going to cost us this, and this is going to set back development for X amount of years. Or how do we build this structure that we don't, that it doesn't result in the degradation of that particular ecosystem? How can we do it differently? Or what can we do differently? How can we do it in a way that there is some sort of protection. Now I see several hands up. I'm gonna go with first with one person that I have not heard from today, and that's Kimberly. And then after Kimberly speaks, everybody else will get it. Kimberly.
I just would want to ask one question. How do we integrate all of this in an existing space? I know someone spoke before about proper planning of an urban area, but a lot of our urban areas are already existing. And so how do we integrate this kind of what we want to see in our urban spaces in what is currently existing, because a lot of the space is already taken up with great infrastructure.
Okay, so this is one of the things that this course is about, and also some, like even recent missed opportunities. So if I were to ask anybody, for me, one missed opportunity was the Barbican, that thing where the Barbican Road, many of us drive there every day, that new road, so we have this nice new piece of infrastructure by Fontana and La Shushan, and we have a nice road, and there is ease of traffic, but in the middle of that road is still these big concrete things dividing the road going up from the road going, well, the road going that way from the road going this way, right? Was a missed opportunity there in terms of creating a space that would have, for example, in that center, it could even be above, not straight on the ground, but a nice set of tree, like a tree-lined road. Why didn't we do that? And I see more hands going up. To me, that's a missed opportunity, because right now we have a situation where people, was it because they didn't want people to cross the road because they were indisciplined? Because guess what? They're jumping over that high concrete thing. Male, female, boy, girl, pregnant woman, everybody jumping over. I don't know. So, I think, is it that it wasn't enough road to do that? What exactly was the situation? And are there more missed opportunities, in various parts of our, I don't know. So let's go. So that was, and we're going to be looking at that today, missed opportunities, as we look at some areas in gray infrastructure and green infrastructure next. I don't even know whose hands to take. Ashley, Roseanne, Rose, Peri, and I'll go in that order. I'll go ladies first. So Ashley.
I agree with you where there has been missed opportunity to incorporate more greenery in urban areas. However, the concern that I have, just from observation, I've lived in Kingston the majority of my life. We implement things, we put in infrastructure, whether it's green or hard, and maintenance is not a part of the budget. So if you were to have, instead of these concrete barriers, which you'll see in other European countries, they have these nice green corridors, but they are maintained. The challenge that we have locally is that these things are put in place and they're not maintained. So you do have on some thoroughfares where that you'll have a small concrete embankment and you'll have shrubs, you may have trees. They're not maintained, and then that then creates a safety issue. Not to say that concrete is the better solution, but I think a challenge with some of the green infrastructure that can be implemented is maintenance.
Okay, and right next to us, it's Dom Rep, and you go to Dom Rep and you see that and you're like, oh, we could do that, but why aren't we doing it? You know what I mean? So we don't even have to go all the way to Europe. You can look right in the Caribbean and see stuff. Agree with you, Ashley. Roseanne?
Yes, Liz, I want to agree with you too on the data, but adding to your point, and I know sometimes sponsors don't like to say these things out loud, but even in the case of planned and what is sustainable and all these different things, we have to deal with the issue of corruption. I know Cheryl mentioned pursues, bigger pursues signing off on things. in my area, for example, which is living along Havendale Drive, there's a development just in front of me. Now, they had to change up whatever, I don't know, how it's supposed to be single dwellings. I can't remember how you, and they send whatever, and you have to challenge it in Supreme Court. By the time I see it, the time don't pass. By the time the letter reached me, the time already passed. So even if I wanted to challenge that, I could not. But then if you drive a little bit higher on Border Avenue, there is a development there that is way above whatever feet it should be. And speaking to another developer, they're saying, well, it's who have links. You understand? They say, well, we weren't allowed, but somebody else, some money probably passed. And to see these things existing, in order to manage and deal with these problems, we must address that issue. Who is signing off and consistently signing off on some of these things? And when we see the failure, how is it being dealt with? Apart from that, I also want to speak about greater stakeholders collaboration when it comes to some development, because I think we have, when it's it's like you dealing with this, and that is your only viewpoint. So you're dealing with environment, and you're looking at all the issues it may have on the environment, and they're looking at, oh, we need to provide housing, so we're looking at, we need this, and you don't have that stakeholders coming together. So if somebody from the environment come together, they know that they are going to face this drawback, that how are we going to provide housing without? So they have to come with a second plan to say, well, while we are saying not to do this, here is how you can do it better. Oftentimes persons are not, you're not having that sort of conversations. And even, I like to see, even for here, we have a lot of stakeholders, but sometimes you organize these workshops and the persons you're expecting to show up are not showing up. They might send a representative who are just there for showing, like, we send that person here just to say that our presence is there, but the deep conversations that you need to have with the persons who can make the changes, they are not there, right? And I see some of these things happening. But for me, personally, I think that corruption is something that, it exists, and that is something that needs to be dealt with if we really want to address the issue of sustainable urban centers.
All right, I will not comment, but yes, agreed with a lot of what you said. And I think one of the things that persons, something just came back to me as you spoke about high rises. So I was in the vicinity of a high rise about a year ago. It was a townhouse, not a townhouse, an apartment complex. And this apartment, one would argue, it's 4 floors, right? It's 4 floors, but it's almost on a hill. And then of course you have this basement, and it's one of the modern townhouses, modern complexes. And there was a fire. Of course, it wouldn't have reached the news because there was no significant damage done. But there was a fire, and the fire truck came. And it was like a baby fire truck, because even though the thing was 4 stories with an underground basement, which makes it 5 stories, the height of each story, because of the high, I think they're high, they're high roofs, so ceilings and stuff, had the fire not been extinguished by the residents and the grounds people of that particular community, the fire truck would not have been able to do much, because he couldn't get to the top floor where the fire was actually on the roof of the townhouse because of an accident by some workmen working on something. It started a fire. So there are several issues to take into account, even when we look at high rises and increasing residential densities and so on in the urban space. Rose, Michaela, Christina, Adrian, and I think there was another Adrian. I don't see you on my screen. Rose?
Yes, first I just want to say that I'm really heartened to hear some of these comments from my vantage points. Where I am, I just want to say and really agree with some of what was said, because as it relates to planning and how we plan, someone asked what is proper planning. We try to set standards and we have policies and legislation, but from time to time we change. And even even with the current laws or the current standards, there are ways, for example, when a government is faced with low employment rate and so on, but they have to really try to how do I say, maybe they try to weigh the pros and cons, but in most circumstances, a developer will succeed in getting something done. And sometimes these are novel developments. Yes, they are approved with conditions, but at times they deviate. They don't really adhere to conditions. Another time again, a government might want to waive certain requirements because of the need, as I say, for economic development. And therefore, it is very difficult for them to really adhere to the laws at times. And for us here to try and ensure there's a balance. So the balancing act planning is really supposed to do, as someone said, to ensure that everything is done in the right way, right place and so on. And we usually look at integrating all the different sectors: economic, social, environmental, and even cultural. But even though we try, we fail because of the name of development. They have made attempts to have the boards even join board meetings with planning and environment. So the attempts at integrating the subjects, and yet we still have problem, again, because of the need for development. And I see I am happy that we are looking at this, because I can push it. When we make suggestions at time for persons to collaborate in their efforts to do things, people don't understand, because from time to time, different persons keep asking to join the approval team. But if we sit and we plan and we tell persons, they don't really do as we say, unless we go to the stage where we have certain standards set for different areas, and these development plans are done for these areas, and these plans are made as laws and cannot be changed. Unless that happens, then we're going to have serious problems with some of our areas and continued impacts of urbanization and so on, which are unplanned for.
And I think what you're saying is that everything isn't equally yoked. So even if you have joint decision-making processes, the economic and social wins over the environmental impact. So basically, we aren't at a stage where we are integrating all three, because one is considered to be like the stepchild of development. I mean, you are the least of the apostles, if you know what I mean, based on what you have said.
And then again, planning is also highly political, whether we want to like it or not. It is political.
Which is what Roseanne was alluding to.
Right.
Okay, so I'm still seeing hands going up. I think in this round, was Michaela you next, or was it Adrian and Adrian next?
It was me. It was me. I would like to speak on the point of corruption. I don't remember the person that spoke on it, but in my view, right? In my view, you guys can rebut, but in my view, I don't think corruption is the overarching phenomenon as to, private sector, public sector, individuals not taking into consideration environmental preservation, so to speak. In economics, you'd I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with the concept of market failure, where primarily businesses are concerned with making profits, economic growth. That's the whole thing. And so the conservation of the environment is really secondary. And I think earlier NWC would have spoken about if they have all of these mitigating practices to, preserve the water quality and all of that, it's costly. And therefore, who are going to bear the bulk of the cost? They're going to pass it on to somebody, and more than likely, consumers are going to face some of those increased pricing. So it is easier to not observe all of the stewardship of the environment because you don't pay all of those costs. You don't bear all of those burdens, and therefore the government in this case would step in to kind of regulate all of that. So they would be that mediator and to say, okay, these are some of the things you can put in place in your business process to preserve the environment. And they can also do things on their part to help to preserve the integrity of the environment. So in terms of corruption, I don't think it's the big issue. I think it's the fact that economic growth takes precedence over the preservation of the environment. Because if the
Which
two
is
of them
what
go
I think,
together,
I
it's
think that,
costly.
yeah,
And
I think that's what I think we're kind of saying, that economic
yeah,
growth is taking precedence over environmental conservation, sustainability practices, etc. Okay, what I'm gonna do, keep your hands up, Christina, Adrian, and Adrian. Keep those hands up. Michaela and Rose, put those hands down. I'm just gonna do one more slide or two slides, just because I know you're gonna be speaking within the context of this same area. But if we think of some urban ecosystems, I just wanted to put this on the table. We're talking about green infrastructure in cities such as parks and gardens. And we're also talking about some natural areas surrounding urban centers. So this again goes into sort of some of the profiles of what an urban center is. So we may have, for example, natural areas immediately surrounding some of our urban centers, such as wetlands and forests, and we know their role and functions in terms of regulating things like runoff, water flows, providing services important to human health, such as air purification, noise purification, urban cooling, and several mental health benefits. And we do have some examples of green infrastructure, albeit we also do have some missed opportunities of this urban infrastructure. Keep those hands up, I'm coming back to you. But we're gonna look a little bit at the peri-urban areas and the profile of those areas. I remember earlier, Christina, I think it was you, asking what is the profile of some of these peri-urban areas. And when we think of peri-urban areas, first and foremost, we're thinking of that transitional zone between our urban center and our rural areas. So what are some of those regions in Kingston that, not in Kingston, in Jamaica, for example? And they represent a wide range of uses. So we have water catchment, forestry, recreation, farming. We also have things like industrial agglomerations, waste treatment plants, recycling, warehouses, agricultural markets, labor markets, goods transit, transportation yards, ecotourism. So for example, would we consider like Gordon Town a peri-urban area? I'm just throwing that out.
I would.
So many of our ecosystems do provide, our peri-urban ecosystems, they're the ones that provide resources, buffers, capacities to reduce vulnerability in our urban areas. So that gives you a sense of how important these peri-urban systems are to the functioning of urban centers, right? as such, what we're saying, it also is important in development planning to mainstream the opportunities and the services that we get from peri-urban areas. So as we look to things like development planning or development orders or sustainable development plans, how are we incorporating this notion of the peri-urban ecosystem, of incorporating ecosystem-based adaptation within the context of these urban plans, these regional plans or sustainable development plans, recognizing the significant role that peri-urban centers play in actually supporting our cities. All right. We saw this morning when we were talking, who were we talking to? Was it Dwight? And he spoke about, you know, Staten and how, you know, the urban areas and how they do some redefinement. But one of the things I think, and Adrian, if you're here, correct? Oh, you're here. No, it's not Adrian Watson. Dwight, if you're here, they're neither geographically nor conceptually well defined. And because of their complexity as well, and sometimes these peri-urban centers blend in to our urban centers. Okay. They're usually located at the outer limits of urban and regional centers and the rural environments, and the rural environments, an ever-changing zone of both interaction and transition based on their geographic location. Now, if we're looking at urban resilience generally, what we need to actually recognize is the role of ecosystems, the role of peri-urban ecosystems, because how do our current policy environment recognize the role of peri-urban areas, and importantly, recognize the role that peri-urban areas are playing in creating resilient urban centers in Kingston? Is there anywhere that we can see that sort of information presented in the policy space? Examples of urban and peri-urban ecosystems, some examples, we had said before, parks and so on, but we could also look at urban trees, plantations, wetlands, rivers. But one of the things that we do not often recognize as examples of urban ecosystems are things like home gardens, green rooftops, right? All of these can be defined as urban ecosystems. Now, one of the characteristics, one of the things we said about urban areas was we spoke a little bit about the opportunities in urban areas in terms of jobs, etc., that people get, that people are able to access. But in peri-urban areas, one of the things that really comes out here is the levels of poverty. Persons in those areas are generally poor, many are marginalized, and many depend on, they produce primary goods and services, and they depend on the urban centers to actually purchase those, right? And how have these semi-urban, so what we also have is outward expansion of cities and urban centers, changes in the land use patterns have transformed this whole rural hinterland into semi-urban areas, right? Or peri-urban areas. And we also saying that the persons that live there are vulnerable to, and in becoming increasingly vulnerable because of the deteriorating quality of ecosystems, et cetera, which has its own challenges for the urban centers to which they provide goods and services. So at this point, I'm going to call on the three hands that are up. Adrian, you're gone. The other Adrian. Adrian.
Thanks very much. I like the fact that you brought up the green spaces and peri-urban spaces, because I wanted to tacked out on standards of the development that was being mentioned before. Think that it makes our it's like a missed opportunity when we keep on building on some of our green spaces, because like one of our largest green spaces in Kingston St. Andrew right now is a cemetery, Maypen Cemetery, which is kind of weird. And the purpose as I understood it, in terms of the inclusion of these green spaces in the standards of development for urban areas, also included disaster risk management, in terms of, if you compare COVID to the Spanish flu, one of the studies in the US was looked at how hospitals use those green spaces, those large green spaces, as treatment areas where persons recovered from the Spanish flu quicker once they were put outside in the sun. A similar test was done for COVID, and the same thing held true. You put persons outside in a contained green space, expose them to the cleaner air, highly circulated air, and they would recover faster. And then they also serve as corridors for movement of other species from the rural areas to urban areas to control things like mosquitoes who pass on dengue. So again, when we speak about missed opportunities, it's the missed opportunity of closing some of those rural to urban migration of biodiversity, the levels of disease in our population, especially our urban population, who are rendered vulnerable. And then, of course, Rose spoke about the standards of buildings versus the standards of the size of or emergency vehicles. We should be building in accordance with the utility vehicles that we have access to. And sometimes those same green spaces provide a vantage points to some buildings to help us do that. I already mentioned that the medical services already. So I'll leave it there for the interest of time.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks for your input. And Rose, is your hand still up? No?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Let me check.
I'll put it down. I don't see that
Okay,
other
all right.
Adrian. I don't think your hand is. Oh, your hand is still up. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, all right, so let me go ahead. I was going to comment much earlier on the previous section, but because you changed the order of the hands, I'll just focus on the one that's in front of us. Peri-urban areas are very important, largely because of the issues pertaining to green states, which is absolutely true. And the one that Adrian #1 just brought up, I didn't really see that before, but having, referenced the example provided makes perfect sense, because we need to factor those things, especially in scenarios like those, such as disease pandemics. And he brought up the two perfect examples, the Spanish flu and COVID-19, because there have been pandemics that have had the most amplified impacts globally and also nationally here as well. So this is something it's also something worth mentioning. Another thing I was thinking about, apart from this green space, is looking at issues like agroeconomic zones in peri-urban areas. I'm not sure if we do have any, but I believe agroeconomic zones in peri-urban areas do amplify these areas, and even those of cities, their resilience in terms of food security, because having agroeconomic zones amplify a peri-urban area's chance to shocks and stresses that do come about as a result of food security issues. For example, let's just say in the context of price increases, or in the context of trade shocks or shocks from global trade, we can always draw on agroeconomic zones as a form of backup. Or, they also, you can also use that time to actually, step up or amplify the ability of an agroeconomic zone to compensate for the loss that we endured as a result of the shocks and stresses. So, for example, agro-parks are one such example in peri-urban areas. Another thing I was looking at, or another variable, sorry? Some other things, continue. Okay, another thing I was looking at in terms of agroeconomic, in terms of peri-urban areas, sorry, was transportation. I know it wasn't really focused on here because peri-urban areas do possess some level of sufficient housing stock, and even smaller economic centers really. I mean, having economic centers in smaller economic centers in peri-urban areas, to some extent, not entirely, they do reduce the pressure on some of the larger cities, because in terms of daily back and forth movement, you won't have as much traffic problems or as much congestion problems, or even air quality problems to some extent. So looking at those things is crucial. Looking at those things are crucially important. In the interest of time, I'm just going to leave it there.
Okay, so it's good that you brought up agriculture, because what we're looking at is just an overview of, I mean, I mentioned some of it before, but just some of the ecosystem services that we get from peri-urban, by peri-urban areas that go into urban areas. So we're looking, you mentioned a lot, Adrian, about peri-urban agriculture and that link with food security. Water security is another service that we get, as well as energy security. I mean, when you start to think about things like, if possible, waste treatment plants, for example. But there are also other types of services that we get. So like health services, air purification. So we've been talking a lot about these in various comments that you have had. Vegetation and green spaces and the role that they play in helping to remove pollutants from the atmosphere, and also the role that trees and soils play in helping to reduce noise pollution from heavy traffic, construction works, and other human activities. And of course, we can't forget the notion of economic security, where urban and peri-urban agriculture, for example, can provide or can enhance the livelihoods for urban and rural poor. Okay, anyone wants to add to these in terms of the services that are provided? Because what we want to go on to is some of the loss of ecosystem services in urban and peri-urban areas. We spoke a little bit about things like the increasing waste. We spoke a bit, we've been speaking about environmental degradation, loss of ecosystem services. We probably discussed very briefly rapid urbanization and how that is impacting ecosystem services. So for example, in terms of the ecosystem service, what is causing the service to, what is resulting in the loss of service? So if we talk about provision of water, what are some of the factors leading to a loss of service of that ecosystem service? And I think it was Roseanne who mentioned the notion of pollution of rivers, or even waste, the indiscriminate disposal of waste. I think you mentioned the beach cleanups, where if we don't look at how we manage our waste on land, we can always have a beach cleanup, because the waste on the beach is not really coming from people dumping the KFC box or the old doll or the clothes on the beach. It's more coming from the land and what we dump on the land. So normally what the beach cleanup itself is really supposed to bring awareness to how we manage our waste on land. It's, for example, dumping of sewage, population growth increases. All of these are resulting in loss of that particular ecosystem service. And we can look at that, we zero that down to Jamaica. How, what is causing, and we had a long discussion this morning about what is causing some of the loss of that service, and we had a lot of input from NWC. Flood buffers, what is causing that loss of service, right, and exacerbating flooding? Are we constructing in open green spaces, green belts? Are we reducing natural drainage patterns? Are we, through our development patterns, exacerbating floods? Okay. Are we having water logging, for example? Waste assimilation and treatment? Are we infilling and destroying wetlands? Food production? Are we expanding the urban fringe? Are we replacing productive land with things like housing? And of course, climate and air quality regulation, very much related to clearing of vegetation slows the process of filtering toxic compounds from the local atmosphere. So, I mean, what are we doing? How are we losing climate and air regulation? And we spoke a little bit about the heat islands. So I think generally, there seems to be a lot of understanding around the ecosystems, how we're losing these ecosystems, and what is happening as we destroy some of our peri-urban ecosystems, and how that is the impacts on people living in those ecosystems. And certainly we need to recognize that people who rely on these ecosystems as the form of their livelihood, the poor become disproportionately impacted by the destruction of these ecosystems. Any questions, any comments? Anything? Oh, yeah.
Just a question.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Yeah. How would especially where water what is that now? Yeah. Right. How does the inefficient use of it factor into loss, or if I may say inefficient, or the loss of it from treatment to the actual users? How does that factor into ecosystem? Is it factored at all?
I'm kind of lost where I am. I don't know what's happening with my screen. I probably need to stop. Go ahead and ask a question again, please.
Right. I know it was mentioned earlier that you have, what's the word? Is it abstraction? Something like that? That you can take X, I would say, million gallons from this particular source.
Yes, extraction license from.
Right. Right. But what I'm asking is the loss between what you take, treat, and then distribute to the actual user. Is that in any way factored into how it impacts ecosystem loss? Because if you take, say, a gallon, for just loosely putting it, and you lose half of that gallon, by the time we get to the actual users of it, it means that you are taking so much more than you're actually able to recover monies for. And so if there was more efficiency in actual distribution, where you reduce the loss significantly, it means that you wouldn't be taking as much as you do. Was a thought that crossed my mind. I don't know whether or not that is worthy of being factored into that whole thing of what contributes to the loss. I don't know.
You want to respond to that?
Well, I think in terms of EbA, some more thought would need to go into that from our end. Obviously, if there are losses in terms of just like technical losses, pipeline leaks and so on, that does go back, and in most cases underground. So that would contribute in that sense. In terms of an awareness of it from a business standpoint, that is one of the main things that the NWC is actually engaged in now, starting with in the corporate area where there is, we call that NRW, non-revenue water, and it's the same thing that you just described, that disparity between what we actually produce and what we actually sell or account for by sales or meter reading. So we are going all island. The pilot was in Kingston and St. Andrew with the Maya project to basically reduce NRW, and that has been successful, where leak detection and so on and management of networks. When it happens in the wetlands, for example, like I can speak for Bogue. We are in the forestry area in Bogue that's above Duns River. And if there are leaks or any losses between the plant and the down in the distribution areas where people live, then all of this soaks back into the ecosystem in terms of replenishing the said rivers and so on. So some of this in a sense helps, but because we have already extracted it, I understand the fact that we need to account for those. And I can quickly add, for in those same areas, we lose a significant amount of that water now to theft, because somehow farmers are attracted to these forestry wetland areas, and they don't necessarily believe in paying us for this service. So these big transmission lines are often tapped into by them, and because they are not correctly done, oftentimes they leak with no regard for it, because that's something that they're paying for. And sometimes the leaks benefit them as a source of irrigation. So land management is going to form part of how we're going to control even some of these losses that you just mentioned. But in terms of the ones that we are able to control and can see, we are actively pursuing that to reduce and minimize that, so that if it does have an adverse effect on EBA, that we can also reduce that from our end.
Okay, thank you. Does that answer your question, Cheryl?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Before we actually, because we have lunch at 12:30, I wanted to go into some of the interesting concepts related to EBA. And of course, with some of these, we'll go back to some of the other things like EBA for climate change, adaptation, and what it means in this afternoon. But I wanted to just, touch sort of like the meat of the matter in terms of, so we have heard a lot about green infrastructure. We have heard about blue-green, green-blue, either one or the other infrastructure. We've heard a lot about gray infrastructure. But what does this mean in real terms? And what does it really look like in real terms? I'm sure we've been speaking about it. Everyone has heard the concept now about green infrastructure and the role that green infrastructure plays in cities. The fact that when we talk about green infrastructure, we're really referring to vegetation systems, or it's also defined as vegetation systems to improve or promote environmental quality. We heard Roseanne speak about, I think you mentioned, heat islands. Do we all have an idea of what this heat island is? So it reduced the intensity of heat islands by providing shade and evapotranspiration cooling. But one of the things that we often, when we speak about green infrastructure, we don't take into account is green infrastructure also includes things like our rivers, our wetlands, etc. But if we look at the photo in front of us, it also includes things like green walls or biodiversity-rich parks or green roofs or hedges, etc. And that one of the things, as with anything, green infrastructure also constitutes a form of development. And if that development is poorly designed, it can actually compromise urban biodiversity, or it can be a source of pollution. But it is considered to be a best practice if done properly, especially within urban centers, and combined with what we refer to, or what we have been mentioning as that gray infrastructure, so all of those buildings that you see there, to achieve these higher levels of sustainability. But what do you think would be the benefits of some of green infrastructure? If we look at it from the human perspective, what could be some of the benefits of incorporating things like green walls, green roofs, more trees, etc.?
Cleaner air, possible
Cleaner
mental
air,
health benefits,
possible mental health benefits,
reduction in
Cooling,
surface runoff,
reduction in surface runoff,
cooling and protection from extreme sun exposure.
cooling and protection from extreme sun and exposure, reducing
Reduction
flooding,
in soil erosion.
reduction in soil erosion. What about urban drainage? Would it improve urban drainage? Yeah.
in terms of reducing surface runoff, yes, if they're
Yes,
maintained
Right.
properly.
yes, yes.
What about anything to do with land regeneration? If we have more urban spaces?
It depends. It depends if you're bringing back wasteland into
Yes,
some
yes,
kind
yes.
of use. It would be of value.
Right. And I can add, like, for example, where the bauxite mined out lands are restored, they bring back these wasteland and we see them, coming back to be used again.
Okay. Wildlife and habitat.
Yeah. But if I may just chuckle a bit, this is bringing back country into city.
But it can also look nice.
No, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, I'm not saying it is all right, but the fact is we're actually, if I may put it, what we had before when you put something in it that is now morphing and presenting all this challenge, we are bringing back a lot of what we had removed to make it a better place, to make it a more livable place, which is why I say you're integrating elements of what the country that we grew up in, rural area, back into the urban space. So with your green roof, I think naturally in the rural areas, a lot of times you had trees all around you. That's one thing. And you had fresh fruits and vegetables at your disposal, which some of the green roofs can provide, we never said that, economic opportunities for those who are maintaining it, because in other jurisdictions you do have where it provides vegetables and all kinds of other things. And so what we have lost in the speed for development, these technology, valued and important, and yes, ought to be done, is bringing back some of those things which we threw out a long time ago, to become urban.
What about property value? How may property value?
It would improve property value.
It will increase, right?
And make it a more desirable place to live.
It also improves the aesthetics of the environment. Yeah.
It improves the aesthetics of the environment and property values. Ashley, your hand was up.
The point that I want to bring across is, whilst these are benefits that we're listing, I think it highlights the point again for a wide stakeholder consultation. I've known entities that have explored green roofs, and they will consult their engineer who usually does their building maintenance, and they'll tell them the building cannot manage this. Your roof cannot manage this. It will collapse. So whilst we explore these options, you do need to have a wide stakeholder consultation to see if they are applicable for the Jamaican context and applicable for the individual context as well.
What about going forward? So we have several new developments. I mean, if you look in Kingston, I mean, there was a comment once, if you stood on a roof in Kingston, you would see tons of what you call those things, the cranes, the overhead cranes. And that is a marker of the fact that we're pursuing development. So we're seeing a lot more townhouses, a lot more apartment buildings, we're seeing commercial buildings. We just saw, I think, was it yesterday, something in the paper from NEPA saying that, high-rise buildings is something going forward. Is there a possibility to look at how we include EbA in some of that? I think my introduction slide to this particular section had a building from Singapore in which, I mean, would we be okay, would Jamaicans be okay with having a building that is completely surrounded by greenery?
If I may, quickly, I think I would be, but the fact is, as was said before, it has to be part of the original thought process and integration. It cannot be an afterthought.
Exactly. It has to be infused in the design and the plan before the approvals, etc.
Right, because yes, these things carry weight. And so but nevertheless, I think we still have an opportunity for the existing to see what other use could it be put to that wouldn't cause the collapse of a roof, so on. Because we need to transition, and we need to begin somewhere with this whole transitioning process. So here forward, this is what we do, and we recommend that this be integrated. But for those that already exist, what are the opportunities that presents itself that will still retain the integrity of the structure, but yet providing some other benefits for for us in the urban area?
Okay, Christina, you had a hand up.
I would say that in my field, most of the green infrastructure I've seen being developed and enacted is primarily due to international pressures or markets. And I'm speaking specifically to the tourism industry. While they do have a high impact on the environment, to preserve that international market and standard that they then use to bring tourists in, you would see them use a lot of green infrastructure like wastewater, how they manage their water, their light resources, etc. And that is because of external pressures and not necessarily internal pressure, because it's all driven by their market force. And it's something that I have been thinking about within our local landscape. Is there any new renewed push towards having some of our housing developments reach certification standards that persons would know, this housing is built with a particular type of material that considers climate change, etc., and they incorporate these designs? Because really and truly, if we're keeping it honest, a lot of the developments happening is done by private entities and their bottom line is profit. And so how do we change that marketing landscape so that they can understand that this environmental need can actually help or benefit their profit lines? So yeah.
Well, part of it would be through government policy, of course. How do we, so in approval of these new townhouses, what is the requirement? How are you going to incorporate green infrastructure? So that would be one. So national policy can do that. I mean, we could start from housing policy. How does housing policy reflect green infrastructure? Then we could look at your EIA process. If we're looking at adapting to climate change and we're looking at reducing urban heat islands, how does this road infrastructure, how does this new building? So we go to our local authorities, and just to say, you may not see any of them here because we felt that they needed a session all by themselves, all together, and that would be a next cohort. How do you, in looking at an approval of something, take into account this whole issue of green infrastructure, we now look at how do we create a demand by our market, all of us and all people, to say, well, we're not going to purchase a house where it is pure concrete, even though it is modern and it has glass everywhere and it looks great. What is what green infrastructure do we have there? What is the role of the Ministry of Agriculture in helping people to understand how, for example, or developers, etc., you can incorporate a green roof? Because as I think, was it Ashley? Was it Ashley who spoke about the roof collapsing, or who was it?
Yes, it was me, Ashley.
Right. So how then do you incorporate this within a building? Where do we put it, for example? I mean, we have new offices going up. So for example, a new recent government office that went up is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. That office could have easily incorporated green infrastructure. Did it incorporate green infrastructure? I mean, the last time I passed there are a couple of plants trying to grow, but is that sufficient? What does green infrastructure mean? Because it really doesn't mean just planting a few trees outside your building, right? So these are things that companies within their corporate social responsibility framework, it doesn't just mean maintaining a green space on Knutsford Boulevard and putting up a sign to say maintained by NCB. How can you, in your building, incorporate that green space? So there are so many opportunities that we could look at in doing this. And in front of you, would have the benefits and application of EBS. So I'm going to take 2 questions before we go to lunch, because we come back with a full discussion on green infrastructure and thinking about where, for example, in Kingston, we have seen the incorporation of green infrastructure and what are some of the opportunities that we could employ. So Ashley and then Rose, Karen.
I'll be quick since we're near to lunch. It's really a comment. I think moving forward, what's probably needed is a combination of the carrot and the stick. Whether it's you wish to have tax incentives or laws or policies to force hands, because I believe it was Christina who mentioned it. At the end of the day, the housing market, construction, it's for profit. I think a lot of it, I think that public education also needs to be a big part of this push so that the market can make these demands. They need to understand why paying, for instance, 5 million more for this very small apartment that is now very environmentally sound will in the long run be more beneficial to them, so that they can say, well, I will not purchase a unit that doesn't have these things. I will not build an office that doesn't have these things. So I think that there needs to be a push for public education to get the populace to understand, and then you start to see changes.
And I think one of the things that we need to recognize as well is that we may sit here and think that having these green things is going to cost more, but the truth is it may not, because we haven't really costed them, if you know what I mean. So it may not really cost more, but then we have to look at the maintenance as well, which is something that is a cost that comes after. But Kemar and then Rose. Rose, is your hand up? I'm not even.
Yes.
Go ahead, and then Kemar. And
Okay.
then after Kemar, we go to lunch.
Yes.
Just because I see a few people leaving. Hold on. That we come back at 2 today and we go until 4. So Rose and then Kemar.
Just wanted to say quickly that while we consider all the benefits of the green infrastructure, we need to realize it's costly too, because for example, the green roof, it's very costly to maintain. And we know, yes, we talk about adding benefit to air quality and all the environmental benefit and so on, lifespan of the roof. But unless we give like incentive, as was just said here, or maybe subsidize the costs, some persons might not want to do it. And with those buildings that exist, that you know the weight would be too much, we can always try and reinforce buildings. So it can be encouraged, but as it was heard already voiced, that with public education and maybe incentive or subsidy.
I think to even government, because you have the NHT and they're building houses. How could they, for example, at the roof in towers, and if we can get a picture of that, we could probably look at it this afternoon and see, could it have incorporated green infrastructure, for example? And I mean, because you begin, sometimes it takes one doing something for others to say, oh, wow, that looks great. And then, you do it and it's feasible and it's et cetera, et cetera. So, it's
And it
about
would work.
creating demand for it because we're not even sure it's more expensive.
Okay, I know the maintenance, because people have started, but like in some countries, people stop. But even we're at our building, I don't know if you remember where we are on Halfway Tree Road. We have a lot of birds because they have damaged the trees where they were. So they are on our buildings and they wreak havoc with the cars. But our roof, if we could just do that up there, then we would help those birds, to create some habitat for them, some place for them to stay, instead of having to have the birds running up and down. So I'm here pushing. I would wish for something to be done. So I'm glad that it has been raised here so that we can move forward. I'll surely be mentioning it in my report for the wildlife, especially with this building being used to support habitat for wildlife, which are the birds that we have here now.
Yeah, and birds they ought not to pose a problem, right?
Oh Lord, a lot of them, and they mess up the building, the entire building, people's cars. If you go out there, they poo on you too. Lot of pigeons.
Right. I mean, I have in my backyard a line of it's I don't know the name of the palms. They're not the regular palms, they're the tall ones. And there are lots of like ball pits, and they just go there in the nights and they sleep and they play. And I have never seen like mess anywhere in my backyard from those birds. So that's a point. You can actually have trees and so on, Kamar.
Yes, I just wanted to lend support to some of the points that were made earlier. The thing is, though, that what we need to do is, as you mentioned, is to begin to value our ecosystems and the green infrastructure that we are trying to promote. Because given that most of our development is being done by the private sector, and as I said before, for them is about dollars and cents. So they need to see the benefit in their dollars column of the advantages of going that route, because without that, then there is really no benefit to them, and they can easily pull out of the sector if they see it as too onerous. So the onus is really on us to begin to show the benefits in the cash column.
Yeah, true. And as I say, we need to like set some examples. So in addition to showing the benefits, there is the policy framework. There are things that we have like EIAs, we have development orders, we have our local authorities and what they would approve. And then we also need to look at in the space where government can illustrate best practice, that may be a good thing as well. So if we're looking at NHT and you're looking at housing developments, if government is developing building new buildings, such as new ministries, new agencies, new commercial buildings, how then can some of these practices come into play so that you begin to showcase these examples across the country as one of the several steps that we need to take to improve the demand. And we have not even spoken about, like street, looking at the notion of street trees and how those can work, and street vegetation, etc. But on that note, I will end this session, go to lunch, and we start back promptly at 2:00. I'll give you 2:05 because we're at 20 to 1. All right. So good afternoon, and we'll be back at